Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Delbert Rohaj and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm joined by my friend
Julia Joja with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown and George Washington Universities.
I should say that our friend Giselle Donnelly is running late and she might be joining us halfway through the podcast at some point. On the Eastern Front, we talk about the many challenges to European peace and security that have erupted along a line running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the Eastern Front, and about why those matter to the United States. Our special guest today is Dr. Franziska Brandner, the Parliamentary State Secretary for Economic Affairs and Climate Action in Berlin, and also a member of the Bundestag. It's a great pleasure to have her with us. And if you enjoyed this episode, you should consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. Dr. Brandner, 1 month after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you wrote a very compelling piece for European Council on Foreign Relations, where you made the case for what you called European sovereignty, and you outlined specifically 4 areas of policymaking where Europeans ought to step up, partly as a response to Russian aggression. You mentioned an increase in military capabilities of European defense forces. You mentioned cybersecurity, you mentioned energy, and finally you mentioned the need to really bolster finances of economies that are most directly affected by the economic fallout and the energy fallout of the Russian aggression. So here we are, a little over a year later. What's your assessment of the progress that's been achieved over that year? What were the sort of high points? What were the disappointments of that period? And where do you really see Europeans as falling behind what you prescribed in your initial reaction?
Of course, the terrible part about it is that this war is still going on. And the news we're getting from Ukraine are, of course, difficult news. So I think, in a way, we have come a long way. And when you compare it to, at the beginning of the war, many analysts were saying Ukraine will fall in a couple of days. And I'm very happy that they were proven wrong. But it's also not the case that the war is over yet. So I think, that it's what I have been very much working on, and I think where we can be sort of proud of is that we have not yet seen a falling apart of European member states or the Europe over Ukraine, and that we have had difficult moments, be it over some sanctions or be it over some energy issues, but that we've always managed to come back together and unite the front. And I think that should not be underestimated when we look back over the last year. And it should be for all of us a priority to maintain that united action. And of course, also it's been a year of very close transatlantic cooperation, which has also been important to us, that we had a real partner on the American side. And there's a real partner for Ukrainians. So I think it's been, in that sense, looking back, I think that is certainly positive. But is it, enough? Is it good enough? What else could we have done better? I think these are questions we always have to go back to and see what else needs to be done as long as the war is going on.
So then let me follow up directly on that and ask you what else needs to be done, specifically on Russia. You have been one of the most involved people in the decoupling from Russian energy, in something that indeed a year ago we wouldn't have thought it would have been possible. A continent and a union that was mostly dependent on Russian energy, gas, oil, coal, even parts of nuclear energy, is now mostly free of it. And yet, when we're looking into the numbers, it's not exactly that. When we're looking into sanctions and a price cap and exceptions to sanctions, but also sanctions evasions, as we're seeing reports over the last few months. So it's unimaginably good compared to a year ago, but it's not perfect. So then my question is, you having this overview about on Russian energy decoupling, can you give us your take in terms of what still needs to be done? What are your priorities in Germany and beyond at the level of the European Union to finalize successfully this decoupling?
As you said, a year ago, when we were saying at the end of the year, we want to be independent of Russian oil, gas, and coal, people were saying you're just crazy, and you will have a very deep recession. And I'm glad that we managed to become independent without a deep recession. And I think, the one thing is becoming independent, and the other is the price you pay for it. And the price that many had predicted was extremely high. And I think that was the important part as well, not just to become independent, but not to go into a very deep recession economically. And I think that we have been working very hard over the last year to make sure that we gain the independence, but also that we are not financially at the end so weak that we cannot support Ukraine any longer. And I think it was always these two dimensions we had in mind, is to say, but with all the sanctions we undertake, we're not allowed to weaken ourselves so strongly that we cannot support Ukraine any longer. And that was a tough bet to know what steps to take, and a lot of debate about this also in Germany. I remember very vivid debates with many experts, very different expectations, very different analysis and provisions. So I think, in the end that worked out well. As you know, the EU has set up a sanctions monitoring coordinator now. There are many conversations happening about how can we improve the implementation of the sanctions, because evidently with any sanction that is in place over some time, you have creative people who find ways around. That's normal. It's nothing specific about these sanctions. So it's usual that after a certain period of time of sanctions in place, you have to check if the implementation and the enforcement is still working. And our ministry has made a couple of proposals on how to improve that enforcement. I give you one example. Usually, everybody has the obligation to signal to state authorities when they get notice of sanction circumvention. That is not the case for the Ukraine sanctions. So you don't have that as a mandatory obligation for everybody to report that to the authorities. That's something we would like to get at the European level. So there are things in there where you know what could make them more effective. And then there's the second dimension about what other sectors or what kind of new sanctions do we need. And we have been proposing for quite some time sanctions in the nuclear sector as well as in the digital sector. You have to be on both sides very precise and make sure that, again, you hit the right targets and not the wrong ones. So there are, of course, negotiations going on, but we think that these are areas, not the entire spectrum, but where you could identify some dimensions for further sanctions. So we believe it's both. It's making the existing ones more effective and potentially adding new ones.
Just as a quick follow-up, if you can clarify, we can kind of guess nuclear sector. We know that we're importing still bits and pieces necessary for creating nuclear energy, but what about the digital sector? Can you tell us in broad terms what you would want to target with that, where we have our weaknesses in Europe vis-a-vis Russia?
No, it's not that we have weaknesses, but I do not want to go into very much detail. But the first question you raised and what I've written in the past is about cybersecurity, which is a really key dimension of security today.
So I wonder if I could move to the other sort of big ticket item on your list from around a year ago, namely military capabilities and hard power. So the Chancellor obviously set the expectations very high in the immediate aftermath of the invasion with the Zeitenwende speech. And a year later, it feels like we are sort of having the same conversation in Washington as always about, Germans not doing their fair share and Germans being slow and Germans fudging the numbers around defense procurement. What's your take? take on that historic change that arrived in Germany, or perhaps hasn't arrived?
I think it's been quite a difficult debate in Germany about how to spend the 100 billion, which is not nothing. Like it's a huge amount. Of course, it's not in 1 year, but over a couple of years. And next to the money, we also had legal changes in the procurement policies of speeding up the procedures. So there are, a number of tracks that are relevant for that. And we also had a change of minister in the meantime. So it's also relevant, I think, to admit that the current minister has not been in place for too long. And he seems to be really tackling the more maybe deep-rooted problems in terms of the procurement field. That's at least what he has been publicly saying. And we should give him the benefit of the doubt that he's really working on it. What I think we still have to improve is our European coordination and cooperation in making sure that we have good common projects and little duplication. So I think, on the entire European dimension, I think we also still could improve in terms of making our defense industry more coherent and more competitive. The implementation of the funding, like the funding is massive. So I think, it's really fair enough to say that Germany has turned around on that question. The implementation of how it will be spent has been worked on now for the last couple of months, but I think it will take some months as well to change it. It's a profound change, and so it's not our ministry doing. So I want to give the new minister I think it would be wrong to say now this has been, well or not good enough, etc. I think he's seriously and hard working on it.
Since we're talking about transatlantic relations, you, Frau Brandner, have mentioned that several times. I want to ask you about how you see U.S.-Germany relations going. I know I'm sort of caveating it here because I know you're personally an Americanophile, that you have valuable experience here, that you've worked very much on building the transatlantic relationship. And yet, of course, like in any relationship, especially a complex one such as the one between Germany and the United States, there are hiccups. One we mentioned with U.S. expectations vis-a-vis the military spending, but also we've seen over the past few months, year, issues broadly transatlantic around the U.S. Inflation Protection Act, and not only. So if you are to look back and then look a bit ahead on the level of the bilateral relationship between the United States and Germany, how do you assess things?
I think that the relations between Germany and the US are very good, and in many areas and on many levels. It's been a very intense relationship, working out what we were just discussing, the sanctions, for example. I think, a very close cooperation, on the support of Ukraine, very close cooperation on energy. So, a number of areas where I think, the cooperation has been excellent. And then I think, in terms of what's still ahead, you were mentioning the Inflation Reduction Act. I was always saying, in a way, it's great that the US government has made a very relevant contribution to the next generation of our new technologies, and that we should, in a way, also recognize this and not just complain about it. And I think that was part of the message I was trying to convey, not just to say, oh, this is horrible and awful, but also to say, so many of the Europeans have been complaining in the past that the US was not doing anything about it. So I said, maybe we can first recognize that it's good that something is happening. And then in the second step, say that we have questions about the exclusion of European or, Japanese or South Korean companies. But that's sometimes, I think, the difference if you are somebody who understands the US and who knows about it and who knows how difficult it is to get majorities to pass such a bill, that maybe you do not just start by saying this is horrible, but you also recognize the way they have made. So in that sense, and I also think that we have to do our own homework. It's not just that we can put the blame on the US, but we also have our own difficulties that we should address in terms of our state aid being faster, less complicated. And that's now what the EU is working on. And I was very much pushing also to say, look, let's look at our own difficulties, let's work on them. And then let's partner with the US to create this common space for the new technologies. And let's try to get access to the process in the US and also allow access to our process. And, it's quite interesting because we had now the German equivalent a bit of the debate where we do support now heat pumps financially. And there comes an American investor and buys a German company, and everybody goes like, "Oh, this is the end of the world." And I was like, "Maybe it's not. Maybe it is not the end of the world." And so I think we have to be recognizing that these are very difficult times, and we need to be on top of the technological development. And for me, it's not the US versus Europe, but we have to make this a joint battle, a race to the top and not to the bottom. So, are there no questions or no difficulties? Certainly not, there are. But I always try to work on them from an angle of partnership and not assuming the other side wants the worst for us, but maybe we can still work out better ways of solving the same problem, be it on the European side or on the American side. And I think, this is possible with the current administration, and I hope, that we will keep that spirit because, of course, in difficult times, there are questions. But yeah, the cooperation mood is the one prevailing, which I think is important.
I think it's very heartening to hear, especially at a time when I think the banner of European sovereignty or strategic autonomy is taken by some as meaning greater autonomy of the United States in particular. And I think at a time when we are facing on both sides of the Atlantic unprecedented challenges, whether it's Russia and China, I think it's important to overcome this narcissism of small differences that has always been present in the transatlantic partnership. Maybe to bring the discussion closer to the Eastern Front, so to speak, I was wondering whether I could ask you about Poland and about German-Polish relations. I mean, it's a subject that I think we are somewhat conflicted on, partly because obviously Poland is an important country. It's a big country that should be exercising its influence within the EU, should be punching above its weight in the context of the current war. I think Poland has been a massive force for the good. At the same time, there are reasonable concerns about incumbent entrenchment, culture wars getting out of control, and then there is this sort of very sensitive topic of the Polish-German relations and the topic of reparations coming up in the Polish conversation. So with your experience both from the Bundestag and from the European Parliament, what is your assessment of, first of all, the Polish role in Europe and the role that Poland could possibly play, and also of the relationship, which again I understand is very complicated, but still is an indispensable one for the EU to function properly.
Totally. And if I may say one thing, which is a bit more general than Poland, but for many years there was within the EU the Visegrad, the four that were blocking, and I had the impression that they were not a force for driving things forward, but trying to block. And I think that has fallen apart in a way that now Poland and the other member states of the former Visegrad, maybe Hungary is still a bit different, are playing a very constructive, forward-looking role within the EU. And I think that this is one of the most, important changes within the EU that few do notice. But I think it's a very important one to notice. And we should be building on this to make sure that Poland and the other member states that were part of the Visegrad before, that they really feel that this is also their EU, that they're constructing it together with us. And I think that this is a spirit that I hope we can carry over. For us, it's a very also delicate question, of course. I myself, for example, I've been arguing and fighting against Nord Stream 2 for many years. also always arguing that we should be in solidarity with our Eastern partners who have been raising the concerns, like Poland. And of course, our Polish colleagues also know that I have been one of the most voiced critical of the reforms of the justice system. But they also know that I'm credible on being on the side of Ukraine for many years now. So it's a very interesting relationship we have, because I always appreciated their concerns and their raising questions and warnings, and I brought them into the German debate. And at the same time, as you say, on the internal stage, I cannot stop also, voicing my concerns. But I hope that we will find European ways about addressing them, and that the rule of law is part of what we are fighting for in Ukraine. To keep that and to keep democracy alive, and that this joint fight for democracy is the one that unites us. The fight for freedom, liberty, and rule of law is one that unites us also when we come about to talk about other issues. And the reparations is yet a totally different issue, which of course is a very delicate one, where colleagues of mine have been working on very intensively.
Dr. Brandner, before we let you go, one quick observation. It's very hard for Dalibor and me in this instance to ask you hard questions, because you sound like and you are a true transatlanticist. And so for us, it's like we're just sitting here and nodding and, and agreeing. But before we go, we also want to ask you about Ukraine, of course. Last time I've had the pleasure of seeing you here in DC, it was in the winter time, and Germany, like others in Europe, was racing to ship generators to Ukraine, as we didn't know how the winter is going to end, and all the questions were around were the winter and how to survive that on the European side, and of course in Ukraine. We've also seen now they're sort of paused Russian missile attacks again and again on energy infrastructure in Ukraine. And we are just hearing rumors and speculating about how much can Ukrainians last. They need all this equipment that is Soviet style pieces of equipment. But on the other hand, the missiles have sort of paused for now, mostly. For the first time in a year or so, Ukraine is exporting energy to Europe. Interconnectors are making progress. So basically, on energy, we want to ask you, or I'd like to ask you, how do you assess the situation as it stands now with Ukraine? And what are your most significant concerns going forward in this?
Yeah, I think, we have come quite some way in setting up also cooperation mechanisms on replacements necessary, and working through the European Energy Community, other actors, to make sure that we are quick and do have enough funding in place, which we have actually, by the way, added as the German side, to also make sure that we have enough funding for that. And as you said, we have also been working on the connections, which are key for Ukraine to be able to export energy. My minister was in Ukraine not too long ago, I think 2-3 weeks ago, and we were bringing German companies also to say, please do invest in Ukraine, and let us help to also work on the future of the energy in Ukraine, so that we do combine the work on reconstruction with the modernization. And I think that is something that we are working now on as well, is to bring that, the forward-looking element into the discussion. And I think that is important, that we do not only focus it's already a lot of work on replacing, but now that we have that momentum, that we can also take a more forward-looking approach to our energy relationship. And that is, of course, for themselves, for example, energy efficiency is a big issue in Ukraine, and other questions also, like, of course, new technologies. And I think there's a lot of room also for cooperation that we are looking at, and we're trying to get also German companies to re-export, reinvest in Ukraine and support that. So it's taking it a step further. And we're doing this in close cooperation, of course, with our partners. We don't want to do any of that alone.
At the beginning of this podcast, I promised our listeners that we would be joined halfway through by our colleague Giselle Donnelly. She just joined us as we were about to wrap up. So I'm not sure we can fit in a question of hers into the conversation.
Good to see you again.
Just so, I'm sorry, we just had a confusion as to the time. Actually, Dalibor, will you indulge me?
Of course.
Francisca, a couple of years ago, you wrote a piece arguing sort of in favor of European strategic autonomy.
Never use autonomy. I never ever argued in favor.
Okay, I'm shorthanding. Let's say you predicted the Zeitenwende. How about that? But I would be interested in your overall view about the strategic attitudes in Berlin and how you see the transatlantic relationship and particularly the U.S.-Germany relationship evolving through all this?
Yeah, very good question. It's been interesting because I've been so much working on trying to make that distinction between autonomy, which means you can be alone in the world, and sovereignty in terms of, you can have means at your disposal to defend your interests, which I think, for me, it's a difference. And I think that, working on Europe to become much more resilient, less vulnerable, more ready to take your own destiny in your hands. That's what I've been really working on for years. And I think, in a way, I was very happy that the German coalition treaty was saying that we now need and want to work on European strategic sovereignty in the way that I described it, not in terms of we want to, get rid of our most important partners or believe that we can be independent of them.
Well, if you stand next to Macron, there's going to be some fallout from it.
I know. I've been debating this with the French up and down. And there is some room where where there's an overlap, where I really always also argued, and it was never as easy in the Green Party to say, we need to invest in European defense capabilities. And I think that this is something where we are still not at the end, and where we can work together with the French, and where I always said it's in the interest of the Americans if we take a larger share of our responsibility, because that was also always portrayed of, saying, oh, Ms. Brandner just wants to stop the transatlantic relationship. And I was always saying, no, they would be happy if we did step in a bit more and did finance a bit more and did work a bit better together. So in a way, I think, we have come quite some way. And I think there are other areas where we still have to become more resilient. This is an area I'm working on now a lot, which is our, in terms of, for example, raw materials and processed raw materials, where we have a very high dependency. And that was one of the first things I started working on here in the ministry. I said, this is the next one we have to work on now. And I'm quite happy that now we have this European Raw Materials Act, that we're building this raw material club with the US, that we make it from the beginning a transatlantic endeavor. And yes, there are many areas that we still have to work on. Cybersecurity, for example, it's still an area that worries me, and where I think we still have to work quite a bit to make us better. But yeah, so in a way, I'm still trying to give us the means we need, in a more difficult world.
Wonderful. I'm so thrilled we managed to fit in Giselle's question, albeit in our usual clumsy artisanal way, which goes a long way towards illustrating how this podcast is made. But most importantly, Dr. Brandner, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. It is really really appreciated. Franziska Brandner is a member of the Bundestag and serves as the State Secretary for Economic Affairs and Climate Action. From Dalibor Rohaj,
Giselle Donnelly,
and Julia Joja.
Thank you for listening to The Eastern Front, a podcast dedicated to security challenges that have erupted along the line running from the Baltic to the Black Sea. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, aei.org, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please do get in touch with us on Twitter using the hashtag EasternFrontPod, written as one word, and please make sure to sign up for our newsletter through the link included in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. Thank you, and goodbye.